The darkness was suffocating, the air thick with moisture, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed off the stone walls. A pair of wide, frightened eyes darted back and forth in the inky blackness, searching for a way out. The dog's body trembled, soaked to the bone, his fur matted with mud and grime. He had been here for hours, maybe even days. His once powerful legs were now weak from exhaustion, barely able to keep him afloat in the frigid water that had pooled at the bottom of the deep well. Every so often, his paws scraped against the jagged stone, desperate to find a ledge, a crevice, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the relentless, icy grip of the water dragging him down. He whimpered, his cries barely audible above the silence. The world above seemed impossibly far away, a cruel reminder of the freedom he once had. The dog didn't know how he had ended up here, only that one moment he was running, chasing a scent, the next he was plummeting, the ground vanishing beneath his feet. The impact had been jarring, knocking the wind from his lungs. He had thrashed wildly, confused, disoriented, but as the minutes turned to hours, his strength faded. His breaths were coming in ragged gasps now. The fight in him was dwindling. He was alone, forgotten. The sun moved across the sky, casting fleeting beams of light into the well, only for the shadows to reclaim their dominance moments later. The dog blinked up at the opening, so impossibly small, as if the heavens were mocking him. He let out a final, weak whimper. His head dipped beneath the surface, the cold enveloping him entirely. This was it. His body refused to fight anymore. The exhaustion was too great. Darkness swirled around him, and just as his lungs prepared to give out, a sound pierced through the silence, a voice. It was distant at first, barely distinguishable, but then there was another. A pair of voices, frantic, hurried. The dog's ears twitched, his body instinctively responding to the sound of hope. He forced himself upward, breaking through the surface, once more, gasping for air. A shadow appeared above, blocking out the sun for a moment. Then another. The voices grew louder, filled with urgency. He tried to bark, but his throat was raw, his voice barely a croak. Up above, two farmers stood at the edge of the well, peering down into the abyss. Their eyes widened in shock as they realized what lay below. The dog, barely clinging to life, was looking up at them with a desperation that was impossible to ignore. The men exchanged hurried words, pointing, gesturing. One of them disappeared for a moment, only to return with a long rope. But how would they get down to him? How could they pull him up without hurting him further? The seconds ticked by. The dog paddled weakly, his body fighting against the cold. Then, just as his limbs threatened to give out once more, the first attempt was made. A bucket was lowered, but it was too small, the dog unable to balance inside it. The men pulled it back up, regrouping. Time was running out. The sky darkened, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the land. Then, a third voice joined the chaos. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged at the farmer's sleeve, pointing at the rope in his hand. He had an idea. His plan was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only option left. The men hesitated, then nodded. There was no time to debate. The boy ran to fetch something, a net, used to carry hay, sturdy and woven tight. It was fastened to the rope and lowered carefully. The dog, barely conscious now, felt the touch of something beneath him. His instincts kicked in, his paws clinging to the net, his body sinking into its embrace. The men above pulled with all their strength, their muscles straining, their hands raw. The rope groaned under the weight, but they didn't stop. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the dog was lifted from the darkness. His eyes fluttered open as fresh air filled his lungs. The stars twinkled above, the world vast and open once more. And then warmth. Hands, gentle, firm, lifting him from the net, wrapping him in a thick, woolen blanket. He was safe. The farmers knelt beside him, their faces filled with relief, their hands smoothing down his damp fur. The boy, wide-eyed, crouched nearby, watching as the dog took his first real breath of freedom. The fight had been long. The hours had been endless. But against all odds, the dog had survived. And as he gazed up at the faces of those who had saved him, his tail, weak but determined, gave a single, grateful wag. The dog lay motionless, wrapped in the warmth of the thick woolen blanket, his body shivering from exhaustion and the lingering cold. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, his muscles twitching from the hours of relentless struggle. The farmers exchanged worried glances, unsure if he had the strength to make it through the night. The young boy knelt beside him, his small hands gently stroking the matted fur. "Is he going to be okay?" the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant rustling of the wind. His eyes, filled with concern, searched the weathered faces of the men. One of the farmers, an older man with deep lines etched into his face, sighed. "He's been through hell. We got to get him warm and fed." Without hesitation, the boy sprang to his feet, running toward the farmhouse, his boots kicking up dust along the dirt path. The older man scooped the dog into his arms, careful not to jostle him too much. The poor creature barely stirred, his body limp, his head lolling against the man's chest. He had fought with everything he had, and now he was at the mercy of those who had pulled him from the brink. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick with the comforting scent of burning wood and simmering stew. The fire in the stone hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. The boy's mother turned from the stove, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the drenched and battered animal in her husband's arms. "Oh my," she gasped, wiping her hands on her apron. "Lay him by the fire, quickly." The older man lowered the dog onto a makeshift bed of old blankets near the hearth. The warmth immediately began seeping into his frozen limbs, coaxing life back into his weary body. His ears twitched slightly, his nose flaring as he caught the scent of food in the air. The boy appeared at his side, a small wooden bowl in his hands filled with warm milk. "Here, boy," he murmured, gently tilting the bowl toward the dog's muzzle. "You need to drink." For a moment, there was no response. The farmers and the boy held their breath, watching, waiting. Then, with a weak flick of his tongue, the dog lapped at the milk. A ripple of relief washed over the room. It wasn't much, but it was a sign he was still fighting. As the night wore on, the dog drifted in and out of consciousness, his body slowly recovering from the ordeal. The boy never left his side, curled up beside him, his fingers idly running through the dog's tangled fur. He had already made up his mind. If the dog had no home, no owner searching for him, he would stay. Days passed, and with each sunrise, the dog grew stronger. The once dull glimmer in his eyes began to return, his body filling out from proper meals and rest. He still limped slightly, his muscles weak from the trauma, but he no longer carried the weight of fear in his gaze. Instead, there was trust, a silent understanding that the people who had saved him had become his family. The boy named him Shadow, for he never left his side, following him through the fields, through the woods, and even into town. The farmers, once wary of whether the dog would survive, now watched in amusement as Shadow took to farm life, as though he had always belonged there. He chased the crows from the crops, stood guard at the front porch, and when the boy called, he came running without hesitation. But despite the newfound happiness, a question lingered in the back of the farmers' minds. Where had he come from? Had someone been looking for him? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, a stranger arrived at the farm. He was an older man, his clothes worn from travel, his boots caked in dust. He carried with him a folded poster, the edges creased from being handled too many times. "I'm looking for my dog," the man said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "He went missing days ago. I've searched everywhere." The farmers exchanged glances. The boy instinctively placed a hand on Shadow's back, his heart pounding. The man unfolded the poster, revealing a picture of a dog, Shadow. The farmhouse fell silent. The only sound was the distant chirping of crickets outside. Shadow lifted his head, his ears twitching. His eyes met the stranger's, and for a brief moment, recognition flickered in his gaze. But then, he turned back toward the boy, pressing his head into the child's chest. The man exhaled, his expression softening. "I raised him from a pup," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "He was my best friend. But seeing him now—" He trailed off, watching as the boy clung to Shadow, unwilling to let go. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, the man let out a deep sigh. "It seems he's found a new home," he said, a small, bittersweet smile touching his lips. He knelt, extending a hand toward Shadow, who hesitated before slowly sniffing his palm. "Take care of him, will you?" The boy's eyes widened. "You mean?" The man nodded. "He's yours now." Tears welled in the boy's eyes as he threw his arms around Shadow's neck. The dog, as if sensing the moment, let out a soft, content sigh, pressing into the embrace. The stranger stood, giving one final nod before turning to leave. He didn't look back. As the door closed behind him, Shadow lifted his head, watching until the man disappeared into the night. Then, with a quiet huff, he turned back to the boy, curling up beside him with a sense of peace he had never known before. He was home. As the days turned into weeks, Shadow fully embraced his new life on the farm. His strength had returned, his once weak and weary body now bursting with energy. He ran through the fields with the boy, chasing after butterflies and rolling in the tall grass. At night, he slept beside the boy's bed, his soft breathing a comforting presence in the quiet farmhouse. It was as if he had always belonged there, as if the farm had been waiting for him just as much as he had been searching for it. But deep down, a part of the boy still wondered about the life Shadow had left behind, the old man who had come searching for him, the home he had once known. What had happened to separate them? He had been too overwhelmed in the moment to ask, too afraid that any answer might lead to losing Shadow. But now curiosity gnawed at him. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted lazily from the trees, the boy found himself sitting on the front porch, watching Shadow chase birds along the fence line. The sun cast a warm glow over the farm, making everything feel safe, peaceful. "Do you ever think about your old home?" the boy murmured, half expecting Shadow to somehow answer. Instead, the dog paused, tilting his head as if considering the question, before trotting over and resting his head on the boy's knee. The boy smiled, running his fingers through Shadow's thick fur. "I guess this is your home now, huh?" Shadow let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping against the wooden porch. But just as the boy was beginning to relax, a strange sound broke the peaceful morning. The distant hum of an approaching truck rumbled down the road, sending a flock of birds scattering into the sky. The boy frowned, watching as a dark-colored vehicle rolled past the front gate and came to a slow stop in front of the farmhouse. A man stepped out, not the old man who had come before, but someone else, taller, younger, with sharp eyes that flicked toward the house with purpose. He was dressed in a dark jacket and boots that were too clean for someone from the countryside. The boy felt Shadow stiffen beside him, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. The boy placed a hand on the dog's back, whispering, "Easy, boy." The man took a few steps toward the porch, his expression unreadable. "Nice dog you got there," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge. The boy said nothing, his grip tightening on Shadow's fur. The man smirked. "Relax, kid. I'm just here asking about a missing dog." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it up for the boy to see. "Looks a lot like yours." The boy hesitated before taking the paper. It was a printed flyer, but unlike the one the old man had brought, this one had bold red letters at the top, "Reward for information." Below, a grainy photo of Shadow stared back at him, his eyes filled with the same fire the boy had come to love. The boy swallowed hard. Who are you?" The man shrugged. "Just someone looking for what's his." Shadow let out another deep growl, his fur bristling. The boy could feel his muscles tensing, ready to lunge at the stranger if necessary. "He's not yours," the boy said firmly, standing his ground. The man raised an eyebrow, amused. "No. Then where'd he come from?" The boy hesitated. He didn't know the full story, but something in his gut told him this man wasn't here for a friendly reunion. "He was lost," the boy finally said. "We saved him." The man clicked his tongue, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? That dog's worth something. You really think I'd just let him run off without a reason?" The boy's heart pounded. Worth something? What did that mean? Before he could speak, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a collar. It was thick, made of leather, with a metal tag attached. The boy's stomach dropped when he saw what was engraved on it. "Shadow, property of Blackridge Kennels. The boy had never heard of Blackridge Kennels, but something about it sent a chill down his spine. "You don't understand, kid," the man continued, his tone turning colder. "That dog was trained, bred for a purpose. He wasn't supposed to end up in some ditch." The words hit the boy like a slap. Trained, bred, a purpose. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He had been part of something. Something he had clearly run from. And now they wanted him back. "No," the boy said, shaking his head. "He's not going anywhere." The man let out a slow sigh, as if disappointed. "Look, kid, I don't want trouble. But that dog, he belongs to someone else. Someone who doesn't like losing." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wad of cash, flipping through it lazily. "How about this? You take the money. You keep quiet. And we take the dog." The boy felt anger rise in his chest. "He's not for sale." Shadow stepped in front of the boy, his body tense, his teeth bared. The man's smirk faded. He looked at the dog, then back at the boy, his expression hardening. "You don't get a choice, kid." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, sending up a cloud of dust as the vehicle peeled away down the road. The boy let out a shaky breath, looking down at Shadow. The dog was still in a defensive stance, his eyes locked on the disappearing truck. The boy knelt beside him, wrapping his arms around his thick neck. "I won't let them take you," he whispered fiercely. "I don't care who they are." Shadow didn't move for a long moment, his muscles still tense. Then, as if reassured by the boy's words, he let out a deep sigh and pressed his forehead against the boy's chest. The sun continued to rise, casting a warm glow over the farm. But for the first time, the boy felt a shadow of unease creep over him. Whoever those people were, they weren't going to give up easily. And now they knew where Shadow was. That night, the boy couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the distant rustling of the trees outside. The house was quiet, except for the soft breathing of Shadow beside him. Every so often, the dog would shift, his ears twitching as if still on high alert. The encounter with the man replayed in the boy's mind over and over. Blackridge Kennels. The words felt wrong, sinister. Why had Shadow run away? Why were they so desperate to get him back? The boy had a terrible feeling in his gut. That man wasn't going to just walk away. He would come back. And next time, he wouldn't ask. A sudden noise broke the silence. A distant thud. Then another. The boy sat up, his heart hammering. Shadow lifted his head, ears perked. Another noise, this time closer. The sound of footsteps outside the house. Someone was there. The boy scrambled out of bed, his breath coming in short gasps. He grabbed the old baseball bat from the corner of his room and crept toward the window. Peering through the glass, he could barely make out a dark figure moving near the barn. His stomach twisted. Shadow let out a low, rumbling growl. The boy placed a hand on his back, trying to steady his own racing heartbeat. Then a metallic clink. The barn door. Someone was trying to get in. The boy didn't think, he just acted. He grabbed a flashlight and slipped out of his room, creeping down the hall as quietly as possible. Shadow padded alongside him, his body tense. As they reached the front door, the boy hesitated. If he went out there alone, would he be able to stop whoever it was? He swallowed hard. He had no choice. Gripping the bat tightly, he slowly pushed the door open, stepping onto the porch. The night was cold, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. A breeze rustled through the trees, but beyond that, everything was still. Then a sound, boots crunching against gravel. The boy's flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, landing on a shadowy figure near the barn. The man from earlier. And he wasn't alone. Another figure stood beside him, both dressed in dark clothes. "What are you doing here?" the boy demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. The men turned slowly, their faces partially obscured by the darkness. One of them let out a chuckle. "Relax, kid. Just looking around." "This is private property," the boy said, tightening his grip on the bat. "Get out." The taller man took a step closer. "We just came for the dog." Shadow stepped forward, his teeth bared, a deep growl reverberating from his chest. The man smirked. Nice to see he still remembers us. The boy's heart pounded. He's not yours. You don't know what you're dealing with, the man said. His tone was calm, almost amused, but there was something dangerous in it. That dog, he's worth more than you can imagine. I don't care. The boy shot back. You're not taking him. The second man sighed, shaking his head. We tried asking nicely. Then, in a blur of movement, he lunged forward. The boy barely had time to react. Shadow sprang into action, leaping between them, his teeth snapping dangerously close to the man's outstretched hand. The man cursed, stumbling back. The taller man pulled something from his pocket, a stun gun. The boy's blood ran cold. No, he shouted, swinging the bat wildly. The man barely dodged in time, the wooden bat grazing his arm. Shadow lunged again, this time catching the second man's sleeve in his jaws, yanking him backward with incredible strength. The man let out a strangled yell, struggling to shake the dog off. The taller man snarled, raising the stun gun. The boy's heart pounded. He had to do something. Without thinking, he swung the bat again, aiming low. It connected with the man's knee. A sickening crack echoed through the night as the man crumpled to the ground with a grunt of pain. Get the hell off me, the second man shouted, still wrestling with Shadow. He kicked out, striking the dog in the ribs. Shadow yelped, but didn't let go. Headlights suddenly flooded the yard, a truck roaring down the dirt road toward the house. The men froze. The boy's stomach flipped. Was it backup? More of them? But then, a familiar voice rang out. What the hell is going on here? The boy turned to see his father leaping out of the truck, a shotgun in his hands. His mother was right behind him, clutching her phone. I already called the sheriff, she shouted. The men didn't hesitate. The one still standing ripped his arm free from Shadow's grip and bolted toward their vehicle. The taller man, still groaning on the ground, dragged himself up and stumbled after him. Within seconds, the truck's engine roared to life, tires spinning wildly as they sped away into the night. Silence fell. The boy stood frozen, his hands shaking. Shadow limped slightly, but he stood tall, his eyes still locked on the disappearing vehicle. His father turned to him, his face pale. Son, what the hell was that? The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. They came for Shadow. His father's expression darkened. Not on my watch, they don't. The sheriff arrived an hour later, his face grim as he listened to the boy's story. He examined the printed flyer the men had left behind, frowning at the name Blackridge Kennels. I've heard of them, he said finally, rubbing his jaw. Not in a good way. The boy's heart sank. What do you mean? The sheriff sighed. They're not a regular kennel. They breed and train dogs for underground fights. Illegal ones. Nasty business. He glanced at Shadow, his expression heavy. That dog, he must have been one of theirs. And if he ran, he was trying to escape something bad. The boy's stomach twisted. He looked at Shadow, the scars on his body suddenly making more sense. He hadn't just been lost. He had been running for his life. The sheriff straightened. I'll put the word out. Make sure they don't come sniffing around again. His father nodded firmly. And if they do, they won't like what they find. The boy knelt beside Shadow, wrapping his arms around him. You're safe now, he whispered. Shadow leaned into him, letting out a deep, contented sigh. And for the first time since that fateful day in the well, Shadow truly believed it.